Hello and welcome to Beit Avichai's program, marking Professor Ruth Wisse's recently published autobiography, Free as a Jew, a personal memoir of national self-liberation. For our program, Ruth joins us in conversation with author Matti Friedman. Ruth and Matti are two authors whose writings many admire and are people to admire, both of whom are not afraid to publicly state their thinking and positions with bravery and eloquence. Ruth has done more than anyone for the establishment of Yiddish literature as an academic pursuit, inspiring many students, many of whom are now her colleagues and friends, to continue the expansion of Yiddish and Jewish studies on an academic level. Ruth is also a powerful champion for the Jewish people in the state of Israel and continues to fight without fear for Israel's right and standing in the world. She has written an important memoir, not for herself, but for us to learn from. It is an honor for us that she joins us to discuss her Free as a Jew in conversation with Matti Friedman.
David, thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks to Beit Avichai for having us this evening here in Jerusalem, this morning in New York. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with Professor Ruth Wisse, who needs no introduction, but I'll give a short introduction. Nonetheless, Ruth escaped from what was then Romania, what is now Ukraine, the town of Chernovitz at age 4. She writes in her lovely memoir, which we're here to discuss this evening, "Our departure was so hurried that when the boy next door came by later that day to ask my brother out to play, he was stunned to find the door bolted and us gone." Ruth's family managed to make it to Montreal, along with her brother Ben. There were 2 other siblings born in Montreal. Ruth ran for student council president in high school under the slogan, "Don't let the student council be ruthless." The campaign was successful. If I remember correctly from the memoir, Ruth's career began at McGill, moved to Harvard, passed through publications like Commentary at its heyday and through many other stations and controversies too numerous to number. And Ruth is, of course, one of a very small number of scholars responsible for making Yiddish a serious and recognized field of studies. And she writes in her memoir, "It's amazing how the study of Yiddish literature had educated me in politics. In sour moments," she writes, "I said that I had been teaching the history of Jewish mistakes." Ruth, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you. Let's just start with the title of your book, Free as a Jew, a personal memoir of national self-liberation. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, Matti, first let me say that it's a tremendous pleasure for me to be here. I wish we were closer together, actually conducting this conversation in the same room. But I admire your writing very, very much, and I hope very soon to be able to perhaps do this in the opposite direction, where I could interview you about your books. As for the title, free and Jew are 2 of the words that I like best. And so what can be better than combining them in a title, Free as a Jew? The truth is, when I set out to write this memoir, I didn't know exactly where it was going. And by the time I was finishing it and having to look for a title, many of them ran through my mind. This wasn't by no means the first one. But it seems to me that this captures better than anything I could say what it is that the book turned out to be about. And that is free as a Jew. What do I mean by that exactly? Obviously, you can't encapsulate a book in a title. But it begins, I suppose, with the Passover story. And as I write in the book, Pesach meant everything to us. The idea of freedom came very much alive for me every year at Pesach, at Passover, because that was the holiday that was observed most religiously in our otherwise not very religious home. And the idea of freedom as a Jew came across extremely strongly because, of course, we had fled Europe in 1940. We had escaped slavery, and we had come to what, as you, as a fellow Canadian, know, is called The True North, Strong and Free. We had come to Canada. So I think that I felt always that freedom is the precondition for the Judaism that I want to practice, and that I think the Jewish people calls for. Freedom comes first. But then the story is wonderful because, as the Exodus story tells us, you know, when the Jews were actually released into freedom, they were a rabble. They wanted to go back to the flesh pots. They wanted security. They weren't ready for anything. They didn't know what leadership was. They didn't know what was demanded of them. And so then you have the story of standing at Sinai, receiving the commandments, and undertaking this astonishing covenantal relationship with God. And that is the freedom to be a Jew. So it's not freedom from, but it's kind of freedom to. And the freedom that I feel is the freedom to accept the responsibilities of living up to that promise. That's what I think gets across, if I worked it right, in this memoir. And then it's a personal memoir because I'm writing just about myself. But as it turns out, the story that I'm telling is basically, mostly, the story of being a Jew in the 20th century, which is the story of national self-liberation, to have been a witness to it and to have been alive during that time seems to me to be the rarest privilege, perhaps, in the whole history of our people.
That definitely comes across, the personal woven in with the national, as we move from your exodus from Europe as World War II breaks out through the 20th century and events in America and here in Israel, or North America, I should say, and here in Israel, because I have a few questions that are heavy on Canadian content, and our viewers who have the misfortune of not being Canadian will have to bear with us. The book opens, growing up in Canada in the 1940s and 50s, I thought everything important in the world happened elsewhere. And I can identify with that, having grown up in Canada in the 80s and 90s in a less interesting city than Montreal. I grew up in Toronto. You write beautifully of your mother after your family's arrival in Montreal, and your parents are trying to hack it in a new country and build new lives in Montreal, which is a city, of course, split between the French and the English, between Catholics and Protestants, with the Jews in the middle in a very interesting way. And this is the way you describe her fixation on language. Mother's insistence on Yiddish was not ideological. With nothing else left of Jewish Vilna, her hometown, she held its language sacred. She bridled at being mistaken for a Bundist because her attachment to Yiddish had nothing in common with the Jewish Bund's Marxist assumptions. And she objected to the label Yiddishist, which implied opposition to Hebrew. People did not understand her distinctions. She scorned the nouveau riche flight from Yiddish, which was the mainstay of her Jewishness. Her Yiddish was marvelous. She never mixed it with other languages. As against the implied link between Yiddish and poverty, she insisted that everything about it must be sartorially elegant. Yiddish muss geschehen ungetan, she said, and I hope I didn't completely destroy the Yiddish with my pronunciation. Tell us a bit about life in Outremont in the 40s, and particularly what did Yiddish mean there when you were growing up?
Well, the most I can say about it is that it was perfectly natural. My mother had moved us from, as I describe in the book, had moved us from Westmount, which is the toniest part of Montreal, and all the rest of my father's family wanted to live in Westmount, spend their lives living in Westmount, and actually my husband and I, eventually landed up in Westmount. But for my mother, that's not where she wanted to be, and as you say, definitely not in the 40s. She wanted to be in the closest thing that she could get to be the way Vilna was, to be among as many Yiddish-speaking Jews as she could find. So we moved into the area where there was a Jewish public library, where there were Jewish day schools, Yiddish day schools, and so we were sent to these schools, to a Yiddish day school. And it was quite remarkable because the people who had settled in Montreal, many of them were extremely well educated, were really extremely sophisticated in their thinking, And so the teachers who taught us in elementary school are people who in another generation would have been rabbis the generation before, professors the generation after. We just happen to be fortunate to have them as our elementary school teachers and secondary school teachers, not in high school, but in afternoon school that we attended after we had graduated from elementary school. And my mother, who had grown up in a house of literacy because my grandmother ran the third largest publishing house, Yiddish publishing house, and Yiddish and Hebrew publishing house in Vilna. My mother, grown up in a literary society. My father was very much attracted to it too. So the house was filled with writers, with books, with magazines, with journals, which they supported in every way that they could. And to me, this was just totally natural. There was nothing forced about it. And when I began to study, my teacher, Max Weinreich, actually wrote the history of the Yiddish language. And there he describes Yiddish as the repository of Judaism. I thought that was wonderful. And by the way, it's a fantastic book for anybody who wants to read about Jewish civilization. The history of the Yiddish language is a wonderful, wonderful work. So he says it's the repository of Jewishness, which is true. But then the problem enters into it when people think that because Yiddish is the repository of Judaism, you can then work it the other way around, and by speaking Yiddish, you could therefore realize your Jewishness. Well, that's another part of the story that I think I tell in this book. It isn't so. It doesn't work in the opposite direction. So for people who really wanted Yiddish to be their Judaism, it then becomes distorted. And I think that that's what my mother was already beginning to feel, that when it becomes a politics, that Yiddish is our politics. We speak Yiddish because that is our nationalism. We speak Yiddish because that is our identification with the proletariat. Well, she felt that that was wrong. And although she never spoke about it in those terms, I think that the understanding that I have really does derive from the way in which she experienced the language.
So if we think about Hebrew versus Yiddish, these two incredible linguistic stories of the 20th century, one tragic and one hopeful, I guess the fundamental feature of Zionism is that it's forward-looking. Our national anthem is called The Hope. It's all about looking forward and optimism. Your career, although Israel has always been central to you, and you've been visiting Israel several times a year forever, except for the past year or two, which I know has been difficult for you, your career has been spent on a language that many consider dead, a thing of the past. And I think we know that there's no great Yiddish revival coming. So is your field, I'm jumping ahead here a bit and we'll get back to Montreal, but because we're talking about Yiddish, the life and death and life of Yiddish, is your field about the past or the future? And when you say you've been studying and teaching the history of Jewish mistakes, I love that line in the book, that the world of Yiddish literature is the history of Jewish mistakes. What is the study of Yiddish really about for you?
You see, it's really hard to get it across. I love your questions, but your questions really point out how difficult it is to explain what seems so obvious and natural to those of us who grew up in a certain way. You see, until 1939, there were about 10 million Jews who knew and spoke Yiddish and used Yiddish. So if you were becoming a writer, Matti Friedman, let's say, at the beginning of the 20th century in Poland, you would have written in Yiddish. If you wanted to reach people, if you wanted to be a journalist, if you wanted to, if you wanted to influence or if you wanted to express yourself, Yiddish is the language that you would use as a poet, as a playwright, because the Yiddish theater began to thrive in those years. When the movies began, there was a beginnings of a Yiddish movie industry. I mean, Yiddish was just the vernacular, and more people spoke Yiddish at the beginning of the 20th century than have ever spoken a Jewish language together at any time in history. So yes, Hebrew was extremely important, and many of the major Yiddish writers were bilingual writers. And as a matter of fact, some of the greatest of them, one of the greatest of them said, listen, Yiddish and Hebrew is like your two nostrils. You breathe out of both nostrils. You don't choose between these nostrils. You don't choose between these languages. So it was not a language war, but of course, with the rise of the Zionist movement and with the idea of reestablishing sovereignty in the land of Israel, Hebrew comes into the ascendancy in a very normal way. It's as if the people itself realized that, look, you cannot unite all the Jews if you do not reunite them with one language. There were 40 different languages coming into Israel when Jews began to immigrate to the country. You could not have a country functioning in 40 languages. And so once the Zionist movement became stronger, and once this realization began to take hold, and once the infrastructure for a Jewish state began to be formed in the land of Israel, well, then it became rather a matter of choice, because it seemed as if you could not sustain both of these languages equally, and if it would take such an effort to take Hebrew, which had really just been a high-status language, and if you had to make it into a vernacular again, a tremendous amount of effort was required. You know, we know about figures like Eliezer ben Yehuda and the ideologues of Hebrew, who wrote the dictionaries and who made the propaganda for the language. But that could never have done the trick. It had to be kind of a national impulse, people understanding, and Yiddish speakers understanding when they came to Israel. Many of them realizing that they would have to understand that they would have to learn Hebrew from their children. Now, you know, one could compare this to the assimilation process in the United States and in Canada, where many people were so happy to give up their Yiddish in order that the children could get ahead in English. But in Israel, it was something different. It was really the reestablishment of a people in its homeland, and Hebrew had to be recovered. It's then that the pathos of Yiddish really, I think, becomes very strong. But if we go back before that, and really the answer to your question and why the language and the literature and the culture are so exciting to me, well, Jews confronted modernity most creatively in Yiddish. And so if you want to know the whole transition of the Jewish people into modernity, I think Yiddish and Yiddish literature and Yiddish culture are really your best vehicle. Now, by the way, all those who are in German history and German studies and who study Buber and Rosenzweig and the Enlightenment will tell you, wait a minute, the process of modernization of the Jews, it took place in German mostly. Well, part of it did take place in German, but if you read Kafka, you realize that those who underwent that process in German felt that they were moving into an alien culture and that they themselves were being alienated from their own Judaism. It's very interesting. I don't think enough has been thought about and spoken about this relationship between Yiddish and German. Those people who lived in German-speaking lands and who adopted German as their language, those Jews felt and were told by their surrounding neighbors, you are speaking the inferior version of the perfect language. And I think that, by the way, that had a lot to do with how Nazism interpreted the relationship of Germans, pure Germans, to Jews. So in the German-speaking sphere, to go into modernity in the German language was really to have to reject a great deal of your Jewishness. But the Yiddish speakers who were really those who had moved eastward into Slavic lands. In those lands, German was not the peripheral language. Polish, Ukrainian, Russian were spoken. Jews spoke Yiddish. Yiddish was the Jewish language. There was no sense of inferiority. To the contrary. I mean, Jews felt themselves much more literate than the people, the peasantry around them. And so Yiddish was very confident coming into modernity in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the literature that you have facing, you know, all the problems of modernity, all the opportunities of modernity, this comes across very differently in Yiddish. And so it registers everything, including Jewish mistakes. I could bring any number of examples, but one of the stories that I love to teach is a very short story by the writer Yud Lamed Peretz called The Shabbos Goy. It's more a homily than a really developed story, but it tells about the rabbi of Chelm taking this figure who is sort of supposed to be a funny figure. The rabbi of Chelm is sitting there very self-satisfied one day, and one of his congregants, Yankele, comes in with a bleeding nose, the bleeding mouth, and the rabbi says, "What happened? What happened?" And Yankele says, "The Shabbos Goy punched me." And the rabbi says, "Well, what did you do? What did you do?" And Yankele says, "I didn't do anything. He was, throwing nuts into his mouth, and he asked me to open my mouth so that he could throw nuts into my mouth. And I thought this was so nice, and so I opened my mouth, and boom, he knocked me in he knocked out my teeth, and look what he did to me." So the rabbi says to him, "You know, Yankele, I see if you opened your mouth and he saw those healthy teeth in your mouth, and he thought, those aren't the teeth of a Jew. That really was too much for him. That's why he hit you. It's not just like that. The reason was because you have these teeth. Next time you see him, don't open your mouth." Well, I won't tell you the whole story, but the story goes on in that vein. Every time this Yankele comes back, having been beaten up again by the Shabbos Goy, the rabbi finds another excuse. You shouldn't have been carrying bread. You shouldn't have strolled so far out of the city. You shouldn't have stood there. And at the end, they have to, what do? How do they resolve this problem of Yankele, who gets more and more vicious as the story goes on? Well, you know what they do? They send Yankele out of town, and they raise the salary that they're paying the Shabbos Goy. And how does Peretz end this story? He says, "You're laughing? Well, there's a little bit of the rabbi of Chelm in each of us." You tell me, this phenomenon that we see in Jews, and very much in Israelis, unfortunately, oh, it must be our fault. What did we do wrong? You know, how did we upset the poor Palestinians? How did we really upset the poor workers and take their jobs away from them, et cetera, et cetera? This tendency in the Jews to find the fault and locate the political fault in themselves, this parable, I mean, I don't see how one can live without it as a Jew in the modern world. So you see, this is one small way in which Yiddish literature really does get you to understand what are the weaknesses of our peoplehood, as well as, of course, for the most part, the great strengths.
It's amazing to think that if 10 million people spoke Yiddish 100 years ago, that's more people than speak Hebrew today. So, you know, it's just a vast, rich world that has vanished almost in a lifetime, or in a lifetime and a half. Just getting back to to Montreal for a second. I'm not quite ready to leave Canada yet, so we're still in this kind of very
Nor
energetic, this very energetic immigrant world in Montreal. Canadian Jews are usually a generation behind American Jews, and I think in many ways Canada is usually a generation or so behind America, which is sometimes a good thing. Many Americans, I think, see Canada as an extension of the United States, and many foreigners see Canada that way. But actually, as Canadians know, it's a very different place, and the political culture is different, and the way people see things is different, and the way the Jewish community has always functioned there is quite different. And you give a very interesting example talking about the Jewish community at the time of World War II, this incredible crisis, and you mentioned two great Jewish Montrealers. One, Samuel Briefman, the liquor baron of the Briefman dynasty, and one, A.M. Klein, the poet. And you single them out as people who were willing to go to bat for the Jewish community in a very vocal way when very few other people were willing to do so, including communal leaders in the United States. And you write like this: the devotion of both these men to their fellow Jews distinguished them from their counterparts south of the border, meaning in the United States, who usually made their mark in society and culture by staying clear of the Jewish community. Jewish writers and intellectuals penetrating American culture in the 1940s were woefully deaf to Jewish needs when it counted most. Now, what exactly do you mean by that? And although you've spent much of your life by now outside of Canada, is there some way that being Canadian defines you to this day?
Oh, yes, absolutely. One of my friends, the great professor of Jewish history and Jewish political history, Ezra Mendelsohn, who taught for many years at the Hebrew University, wrote a book about Jewish politics, Matti, and there he describes exactly what you were talking about. He describes the fact that the best Jewish environment in the diaspora for the community would be one of a multi-ethnic groups. In other words, not like the melting pot idea of the United States of America, where Jews are expected to really just merge into the great, strong majority. And that's, of course, what Stalin and indeed what the Soviet Union wanted, that Russian would become the great, language of Russia, and Jews would assimilate to Russian in the same way that the Jews assimilated to English in America. But in Canada, and especially in Montreal, as you say, was very different. There was no public school system when we were there. There was a Catholic school system and there was a Protestant school system. And there were two ethnicities. This was bilingualism, biculturalism. And so it was very natural for Jews to develop in that context as a linguistic group, as a cultural group, as a separate social group. And of course, you mingled with the rest of the community. Your work usually took you out. Education in later years, of course, took you out into the mainstream. It wasn't that you were in a ghetto of any kind. It wasn't that you were insulated necessarily in any kind, in any way. No, but there was a communal aspect to it that was unashamedly strong. You could build your own institutions, your own hospital, your own schools, and it was almost expected of you in that environment. And so, yes, I went to work for the Canadian Jewish Congress for 2 years. That was my first job. And so I was very conscious of Briefman and Klein having been there just a little bit before I got there. And think of it, the wealthiest Jew in Canada and its greatest writer, intellectual, both of them involved in leading the Canadian Jewish Congress. This is so different from the New York intellectuals who became my model later on. They were wonderful. And yes, they would establish a magazine under Jewish auspices, but the first thing they would say is, This magazine has to be completely free and independent of Jewish influence. The idea in the United States is that the intellectuals, of course, had to stay free of the Jewish community, right? And the wealthy people would try to move into, the Metropolitan Opera circles or the Metropolitan Museum circles. Well, Montreal in that way was very different. And of course it marks us because one always felt oneself to be at the center of, protected by, and responsible for a community of Jews.
In 1948, the State of Israel is founded, of course, and you're a child, but you're old enough to remember one of the great events in Jewish history, and you have some great descriptions of the ideological ferment around the founding of the State of Israel and Israel in its early years. And you have a great scene in the book where you remember overhearing your older brother in the living room with his friends, having this incredibly intense, kind of ferocious discussion about the fine nuances of socialist ideology. They're all about to go to Israel for the summer. They're going to come back at the end of the summer, but they need to have a very serious discussion about the balance between the individual and the collective and the responsibilities of each member of the group to the group. And it seems very funny from 2021, but this all was very important at the time, and kind of furious debate was the was the style of those times, and everything seemed incredibly significant. And you mentioned running into a friend, you're newly married, and you run into your friend Stanley in Montreal, and you're about to go to Israel with your husband Len, and he says, you must go to Kibbutz Sasa, which is a remote, at the time, kibbutz in the north of Israel, and you have to find my friends Nahum and Aviva on this kibbutz, and you have to send them regards from Stanley. And when you're in Israel, you make quite an effort to get to this kibbutz, which is in the middle of nowhere, and you arrive at this basically, tent camp, or a camp of shacks, and you ask around where do Nachum and Aviva live, and someone says, well, Nachum's in the field, but Aviva might be in the shack, and you go around, you knock on some doors, and finally you find Aviva's shack, and you knock on the door, and she opens the door, and you say, we'd like to send you regards from Stanley, and she says, we are not talking to Stanley. And she slams the door. There'd been some, ideological falling out. It just seemed like an incredible, anecdote about those times. And you write a lot about your love for Israel, but you also write that Israel for you is more than just Israel. And you write that what Israel meant to Yehuda Halevi, the great poet of Jewish Spain, and to Avram Sutzkever, the great Yiddish writer who we'll touch on in a second, what Israel meant to those writers also held true for me. I pinned my hopes for human civilization on the ability of Jews to maintain their national sovereignty. My hopes for human civilization, so not just your Jewish hopes, but your broader hopes for humanity, were somehow pinned on the success or failure of this very small national project. What does that mean exactly?
Well, you put these two things into perspective so beautifully. Yes, the small seems so small and fragile. That group of, teenagers talking about whether they should make aliyah and in what form and so forth, and those ridiculous, seemingly ridiculous, but at the time, of course, as you say, totally life-absorbing decisions as to whether to go to a more socialist kibbutz or to a less socialist kibbutz and so forth. That's the small view. And we can't help it sometimes. We're caught up in that part of it as well. But one of the advantages of having grown up at a distance from Israel and from both the collapse of Jewish life in Europe and the growth of Jewish life in the land of Israel is that one sees the whole thing, how it exists, if you'll forgive me, really under the aegis of eternity. And what I can't get over is that other people don't understand that what happened to the Jewish people and what the Jewish people accomplished in the 1940s is, I think, undeniably the most miraculous human feat in history. I know of nothing that remotely matches it, either in Jewish history or in the history of any other people. Consider that for the first 5 years of the 1940s, a third of the Jewish people was massacred under the most humiliating, indescribable, under the most indescribable conditions. So much so that the jurist Lemkin had to create the word genocide in order to describe what was happening in Europe to the Jews. This amazingly sophisticated people, these journalists, these musicians, these scientists, these, the Jews, Nobel Prize, beginning to win the Nobel Prizes and all that, reduced to in the way that they were in 5 years, massacred. That's the first part. But already everything had been set in place for the recovery of Jewish sovereignty in that same decade, after the land of Israel had been under foreign domination for 2 millennia. Now, talking about it without dramatizing it, can you find anything as remarkable? So this seems to me to be really what the Jewish people can accomplish and does accomplish when everything depends on them. I think that when Judaism is a really remarkable civilization, and how remarkable it is, the proof of it is what the Jews were able to do in the 1940s. When you see now how people talk about, oh, we were slaves and we will never get over being slaves and we're still being enslaved and so on. Well, look at the Jews. Look at what they did. They didn't moan and groan, and actually many of them wanted to take revenge, but as a people, they didn't spend their time thinking about taking revenge. No, they thought about rebuilding as quickly as they can in order to bring in all the others who still need the help, how to reconstitute ourselves now as sovereign, as being able to protect ourselves, which we were not able to do before. In other words, learning from the past how not to really live in the same way anymore, but to do it better. So I would say that everything that depends on the Jews is really to be trusted, maybe. But unfortunately, the organization of politics against the Jews never stopped. It didn't stop with Hitler. It simply began again in 1945 with the creation of the Arab League that united with only one thing in mind. The only thing that kept the Arab League as together, all those countries that are religiously and ethnically and in many other ways at odds with one another. The only thing they had in common was their common enmity to Israel. That is why the war against Israel looms so large in the Arab Muslim world. It's the function that attacking Israel plays. Now, here we are, the Jewish people. As far as we are concerned, coexistence is part of our DNA. The Jews from biblical times never existed except through coexistence, never wanted to conquer other countries, never wanted to be conquered by them. But coexistence is what we learned, accommodation when necessary, or creative interchange. But for us, coexistence with others is the most natural thing in the world. It isn't to other countries. It isn't to other peoples. It isn't to other religions. So here you have the problem of Israel and the Jews continuing into the 21st century and beginning to resemble in many ways what it was even before 1948. And so I think the main problem that we have is moral self-confidence. When you are attacked, and when you're being attacked for all that is good about you, I think it's very natural to start thinking, wait a minute, what's the matter with me? exactly like the rabbi of Chelm. Yankele, you must have shown him your teeth. Yankele, you must have been carrying a loaf of bread. Yankele, you must have been doing something wrong. Yankele, you must have taken 2 centimeters more of land than really belongs to you. Yankele, you must be, not extending your democratic rights to the other side enough. And more and more and more, I could go on and on. It's very tempting to try to find the fault in ourselves. Because if you find the fault in yourself, you can control the situation. But if the fault is in others, and if those others are more numerous than you are and are threatening you, it really takes a lot of strength to say, listen, it's their problem, and I'm going to have to find a way of resisting in such a way that I'm going to have to force them to solve that problem and to stop blaming it on me. I cannot assume the blame for the failure of other peoples. And that failure most often expresses itself in grievance and attack on me. So you see, when you ask, why I think Israel is so important, not just to the Jews, but really civilizationally in the history of the world as it develops, it's because of that. I think that there is almost no political force which is as destructive as what we now call anti-Semitism, which I define as the organization of politics against the Jews. It destroys its users because they are organizing their grievance against the wrong party, and that makes it impossible for them to really confront their own problems. So you forgive me for going on perhaps a little too much in this vein, but I can't exaggerate the importance of Israel. And I wish I could explain it better so that what is obvious to me would be equally obvious to others.
Moving for a moment from the grim realities of Jewish history and the dawning realization that many of us have that the revolutions of the 20th century, particularly the founding of the State of Israel, changed some things and didn't change many other things. Moving back to Montreal and to another great Jewish product of the same world that you come from, who is Lawrence Briefman, and where you first encounter him?
Lawrence Briefman. Well, Lawrence Briefman is the name that Leonard Cohen gave to his character that is really based on himself in his first novel, The Favorite Game. And you asked me about him, I think, as a fellow Canadian, as someone who has himself just written a book, a very good book, really remarkable book about Leonard Cohen in the Sinai. I hope you don't mind if I digress from Leonard, Briefman, who was growing up in Montreal in the 1950s, to Leonard Cohen and what he became, the great singer, the great star. I think that you and I are destined to see him very differently. I can't help but see him as a person with whom I met in college, and as I write, who was so vivid, so very vivid. I don't know why, but he was so vivid to me then and ever since that I remember him in many instances more clearly than I remember myself or many of my much closer friends. It was clear even then that he was extraordinary. But I wanted him to become Matti Friedman.
I'm glad he didn't become Matti Friedman.
What's that? You see, he was very bright, very smart, very funny. And my idea of the great Jewish writer, poet, whatever it was going to be someone who was take charge of Jewish subjects, who was going to go out as a Jew into the world, and who was going to be brainy intellectually sophisticated. And then when, you know, the years went on, every time I would meet Leonard, he would be under a different enthusiasm. First of all, he started, you know, taking drugs not seriously, not so seriously that they should damage him, but he was one of the first that I knew that started to experiment with mind-altering substances. And he tried to convince our teacher, Louis Dudek, that he should also experiment with mind-changing substances. And I remember a conversation between them on the campus of McGill. We all three just happened to run into one another. And Leonard was saying, but Louis, you know, you're a poet. You have to try something new if it's available to you. And Louis said to him, Leonard, I go home and I put on Mozart. That is mind-altering enough for me. And I thought, bravo, bravo, Louis. I mean, how stupid, you know, to think that you want to be something else. And then, you know, he would become enthusiastic even before Buddhism about Velikovsky and about the I Ching and about other things, because he was always, he was always Leonard. You see, he was not the intellectual of my imagination. He was going to become this, what he wanted to be, what he needed to be. And goodness knows, I'm not here to say that he made the wrong choice. To the contrary, you have to know who you are. You have to know where you want to go. And he certainly did it his way, all the way, and brilliantly. And there was a point, of course, the point that you write about in your book, where he was in a certain state in his own mind, and he felt there was a war on, a very serious war in Israel, the Yom Kippur War. How could I be in Greece, you know, nursing my misery when I could be there where I might be needed? And that's when he went to Israel, and that's when he went to be with Sharon at the canal, and where he performed for the soldiers in a way that you write about, not just from his perspective, but for what it meant to those soldiers, and then subsequently, apparently, to Israeli culture as it has developed.
Israelis have never forgotten that he came, and he still retains the status almost of an Israeli artist. I think Israelis consider Leonard Cohen to be basically an Israeli artist, and there are very few Jewish artists from North America who have that status. Certainly not Bob Dylan or anyone else you think might qualify. Cohen has a very special status here, and it's interesting to, you know, of course, I grew up with his music and thinking of him as a musical legend, and for you, he's Leonard, you know, a kid from Westmount who used to see around the McGill campus. One of the amazing things that you do in the book, for me, was to bring to life great figures from the world of Yiddish who pass through your life, and their world is really kind of on its way out, and you're on your way in, and you kind of pass. Bashevis Singer and Avram Sutzkever, who's a figure about whom I think I knew nothing until I read in the past few years things that you've written about. One of the most amazing figures in Jewish literature that I've encountered. Sutzkever, he heroically chronicles life in the Vilna ghetto, and he manages to escape the ghetto to the forest, joins the partisans, gets airlifted to Moscow, and eventually makes it to Israel. And in 1959, he wants to come to the United States to speak. He's denied a visa because the Americans think he's a communist, and that terrible American mistake ends up being to the benefit of Canadians, because he goes to Canada instead. And you meet him in your living room, if I'm not mistaken, to a crowd of Montrealers smoking and drinking. He gives what you call the lecture of a lifetime, just an amazing moment where this incredible figure kind of drops from the sky into Jewish Montreal. And that seems to have been a professional and personal turning point for you, because before he leaves, Sutzkever says to you. He asks you what you're planning to do. And you said that you're considering studying English literature. And he said, why not study Yiddish literature? And you think this is absurd. This is a ridiculous idea. And you say, there's no such field at the time. And you write, I laughed and said, and what would I do? Teach Shalom Aleichem? This was just an absolutely ludicrous idea. And of course, you devote your life to it. What made Sutzkever so special?
Well, everything. You see, in turning from Leonard Cohen to Sutzkever, you see how strange this is. You have to understand how puny Leonard Cohen seems to me compared to Sutzkever. I'm sorry to put it that way, but you see, they stand in juxtaposition in my life. Yes, Leonard became world famous and brilliant at what he did. But compared to, not that one does compare them, but Sutzkever, here's a person who also was bereaved at a very early age, and also became a poet very much in relationship to the loss of his father, but then became one of the really greatest poets of the 20th century. This is not just my judgment, but much more than that. It's not that one can ever become more than a poet, and he certainly would have resented anything that said you can be more than a poet. But he began as a poet in Vilna, and then as a poet actually devoted to being a partner in nature. He felt that he was an interpreter of nature, a partner to nature. And much of his poetry in the 1930s was very unpopular among his colleagues because they wanted political poetry from him, which he did not provide. He provided poetry that really was trying to go back to Bereshit, back to Genesis, but to really recreate Genesis in relationship to nature, rediscovery of the natural world in the Yiddish language, through the Yiddish language. And he was going to be this new creator of a rediscovery of the natural world and of natural phenomena and everything beyond it. And then he is caught up in the Vilna ghetto. And of course, he writes in response to what is happening. And thereafter, his life really touches on Jewish history at every point. He's in the ghetto. He gets to be in Moscow just before the murder of the Yiddish literary establishment of that city. Then he gets to Paris in post-war Europe. And then in 1947, he comes to Palestine, months before the creation of the State of Israel. And then from Israel, he travels everywhere, mostly to Jewish communities all over the world, but also to meet with the king of the Zulus in Africa. And may I say this, in 1956, when Israel fights the war in Sinai, Sutzkever goes as a correspondent, attaches himself to one of the units that goes with the army into the Sinai. And of course, he writes poetry about that. Now, you see how unfair, in a way, it seems to me, that Leonard Cohen's single appearance, in a 1973 war that others were fighting, becomes really the landmark of, Jewish accomplishment in the land of poetry. Whereas Sutzkever, who then comes to Israel, creates the best literary magazine that the Jewish world ever knew, Die Goldene Kate, remains its editor for decades, and that becomes really the most important literary home for the Yiddish writers, including Bashevis Singer and others, who published their best work in it. And then, as you say, comes as the ambassador of all this to Montreal, and then, of course, does get to the United States afterwards. And if he does this for me, in other words, transforms my life, he transformed the life of a great many other people as well. He is a major, major figure. And his interpretation of our experience, of Jewish experience particularly, is amazing. The poetry is amazing. So yes, scholars and students will continue to be attracted to his work. There's more and more attention being paid to his work. More and more people will be translating him. But you see, because a poet comes to us from the outside, because the outside recognizes him, he seems to be so much more valuable than the person who comes from the inside. And I would really ask, do Israelis think that Leonard Cohen is a match for Alterman, for Uri Tzvi Greenberg, for Yehuda Amichai? You see, it is partly the fact that he achieves his status in the non-Jewish world that really then makes him so important to the Jewish world. It's only natural, but it's only natural if you consider yourself to be this little tiny minority compared to the great things happening in the rest of the world. Well, you see, I don't happen to see the world that way. Some of the things that happen in Yiddish literature are, to me, the greatest things that happen in the world, and it's our function to bring them out into the world, not to wait till somebody makes his mark, you know, in London and Paris and, you know, elsewhere. And then we say, oh, but he's ours. And oh, he's written a couple of songs that are really so close to us. Oh, isn't that wonderful? I'm sorry, I'm becoming a little ironic here, but you see where my heart is. I love Leonard Cohen's music and I love, you know, what he does, but do I think that he is a match for some of the great Hebrew and Yiddish writers and poets? Frankly, no, I don't.
So from that controversial statement, I was hoping to drag you into a few of the many controversies you've been involved in over the years. I just see that our time is running out, so I'm just going to choose one of your positions, and you know, you're on record opposing the ordination of female rabbis, for example, and you've staked out many positions that were unfashionable at the time and remain unfashionable, and you've stuck to your guns in most or all cases. I'm just going to choose one, which is your consistent criticism of the idea of Holocaust education, which really becomes kind of part of Judaism as it's practiced in the United States, and Holocaust museums, and the idea that if we teach the Holocaust, these things will not recur. And I think the idea between the lines that teaching the Holocaust is somehow a replacement for the living Jewish tradition and a way of maintaining Jewish identity in the absence of religious observance and in the absence of textual familiarity. And you write in your memoir, I remain convinced that the sustained public emphasis on the Holocaust as the prime marker of Jewish identity helped materially to obscure the issues at stake in the post-Holocaust era, to disarm American Jews and their friends, and ease the way of their enemies. It's a very strong statement. I happen to agree with that position, but I think that puts us in a minority, at least until recently. Dara Horn, who's a wonderful writer, personal friend of mine and a student of yours and a great admirer of yours, she just wrote very sharply about that problem in a book called People Love Dead Jews, in which I hear your voice in between the lines in many of the passages. Do you still maintain that Holocaust education was a mistake? And if so, why?
Well, I'm not surprised that we think a little bit alike on this subject. But I'd like to make it clear that from the Jewish perspective, maintaining fealty to that part of the Jewish people that was eliminated is really our eternal responsibility. And we know that we still mourn the destruction of the temples. So we will continue to mourn and to commemorate those who lived and were robbed of their lives forever. I think that's our responsibility. Secondly, I think that it is the responsibility of things like the Holocaust research centers to keep every shred of information, to make sure that the truth is maintained and known. I think that all kinds of effort have to be consecrated to that in places like Yad Vashem. I think that that's of amazing importance, and to keep that history as clear as it possibly can be in the light of what we know will happen, people's attempt to change it and to redirect it in a number of ways. But yes, the idea that American Jewry chose to highlight this one aspect of their history over all others, to make so much of it, and to allow it to represent them, this has really been quite bad, and not just bad for the Jewish people, but may I say it's been a very bad influence on America. First of all, it has really, I think, helped to nurture this cult of victimhood, as if the greatest thing in the world is to be a victim and to cultivate the grievance of victimhood and the situation of victimhood. Well, I think that the Holocaust is a problem of German history and their willing executioners. I think it's a problem of European history, and it has to be confronted as that, as a terrible chapter in European history. How could European history have culminated in something as horrible as that? That is a question to be asked, but it cannot be asked in the form of Holocaust museums. And the other, by the way, great problem with that is, and something that, Dara and others do not necessarily address, is that by isolating the evil of Nazism, what it did is to minimize the evils that began when Nazism was defeated. After all, Nazism was defeated in 1945. So it's very easy to raise Holocaust memorials to something which is defeated. And yes, I know that there are people who are trying to say that there's a great danger of Nazism in our midst. Well, I've lived a long life in many, many areas. I've been on many campuses. I never met a Nazi on a campus. I never met a Nazi professor. I never met a Nazi journalist. I never met, a Nazi running a corporation. And I have met a lot of anti-Jews in other forms who are, in those positions. So I would say that evil, and also evil directed against the Jews, has come since 1945, mostly in other forms. And that by highlighting that form, and by really making it seem as if all political evil is Nazism, I think one has skewed the political record. And that's another reason why I think that a corrective is needed. So these two things, I would say, are separate. The way that we must continue to mourn and commemorate without question, and keep the record. But what we present in the world, I think that that's not what we want them to be talking about. We do not want them to be talking about the Holocaust and learning about the Holocaust. I would much rather that they learn about the Soviet Union and where it went wrong. Where did socialism go wrong? And where did the Arab and Muslim world go wrong? And why isn't it producing the greatest, the new technology and so forth? Part of it has to do with their focus on grievance rather than gratitude. Part of it has to do with their focus on it's blaming the Jews.
I agree with you, of course, that we have to mourn the lost world of Europe, and that the way to do it is not to obsess about the mechanics of the genocide, cattle cars, gas chambers, as you say, that isn't our problem, as strange as that may sound. The way to do it is to understand and celebrate this incredibly vibrant, living Jewish world, the world of Yiddish, the world of Sutzkever, the world of Peretz and Mendele Mocher Sfarim, and this world that's annihilated, and celebrating the life that was lost and not the way it was lost. And I think very few people have done as much for that cause as you have. I see that our time, unfortunately, is running out, so I'm just going to ask you one more question. You write in this very engaging and interesting memoir about your life in the Jewish century, the last Jewish century, through the 1940s and 50s to the 21st century. Jewish worlds die and Jewish worlds are born, and some Jewish worlds don't turn out as planned, and others take strange turns. And you live through it all, and you've described it, in an amazing way in this book, Free as a Jew. Is there a word for optimism in Yiddish, and are you an optimist?
Well, look, before we finish, I have to say, if anybody would make me optimistic, you do. I am an optimist. One of the things that I used to be called when I was a child was, I spoke German at the time, I was called Fräulein Hoffentlich, Mistress Hopefully, because apparently I would use the word hopefully in all my sentences, hoffentlich this and hoffentlich that. So optimistisch, yes, I am an optimist, of course. And I do believe that gratitude, rather than grievance, is really what we should live by. And gratitude is always to emphasize the positive. One of the things that makes me optimistic, by the way, is being in Tikva, where I am at the moment. This is an institution that was just founded 13 years ago or so, and I've been associated with it since before I retired from my teaching at Harvard. So here is an institution that came into being in order to serve the needs of the moment and to serve them spectacularly. When the universities do not do the job that they once did in teaching Jewish texts seriously, in teaching American texts seriously, in teaching world history and thought seriously, this institute comes and takes up the slack and does it. Beit Avichai, where you are, is another institution of this kind, doing culturally, bringing all sides of the Israel spectrum together, generating a new kind of Jewish culture out of the past. These are new things on the horizon. And by the way, I think that there are more people speaking wonderfully and engagingly, and also in important ways today about things that matter than there ever were before. I don't like to hear, you're one of the only people who stands up so courageously, da-da-da-da-da-da. It's not so. There are now tens of writers, many much younger than I am, who are now speaking out, monitoring anti-Semitism, and teaching Jewish subjects in wonderfully creative ways. So I think that there is a new wave of Jewish life on the horizon here in America. One can hardly see it on the horizon yet, but I feel it beginning to come into being. And of course, as far as Israel is concerned, it's been there all along. I think it's only our responsibility to say what is, to emphasize the positive, and not to be ashamed to explain how good we are, and why what we do is so important.
Those are perfect words to end with. If gratitude is the key phrase, then I want to express gratitude to you for being with us this evening, and to Beit Avichai for hosting us, and of course to everyone who joined us on Zoom. I hope we can all be reunited in the real world as soon as possible. Thanks so much for joining us.